In the hot and sticky clay and cypress swamps of Natchez, Mississippi, in 1842, a man named Elias Vance decided to make justice a spectator sport. It didn't start with a crime. It started with a declaration. A single sheet of paper nailed to the door of the plantation's chapel, its ink bleeding a little in the humid air. It said there would be a public trial on the grounds of Blackwood Manor for the betrayal of his wife, Genevieve Vance. The accused, a slave named Marcus, would not be judged by Mississippi law or a jury of white men, but by his own people, his judge, jury, and if they found him guilty, executioners would be the other slaves at Blackwood Manor. The terrifying power it takes to make your own laws, turn a community against itself, and use a man's life as a pawn in a game of marital revenge. This had nothing to do with justice. It was about something else. It was a ritual, a play meant to teach a lesson that was written in blood. Elias Vance wasn't just a plantation owner. He was a king in a kingdom of cotton and fear. His wife's alleged betrayal gave him the perfect chance to show how terrible and personal his rule was. The notice sent a shiver through the 67 people who lived and worked at Blackwood. It was a silent wave of fear and disbelief. They knew Marcus and Genevieve, and they knew with a cold certainty that the story Elias Vance wanted to tell would be more important than the truth of what happened between them. You see, the real betrayal was never the one that was talked about in the big house. It was the one that was being carefully planned, the one that would make every man, woman, and child a part of a terrible lie. Elias Vance was a man whose life was shaped by the hard lines of the Bible and the cold logic of making money. He wasn't old, maybe 40, but he walked and talked like an old man. 2 generations ago, his family carved Blackwood Manor out of the wilderness of the Mississippi. They did it with one goal in mind: control. Control the land, the crops, and most importantly, the people. Elias had taken this idea and turned it into a dark art. He rarely used the whip. He didn't need to. The mind was his favorite tool. He knew that real power wasn't about breaking a man's back. It was about breaking his will, isolating him, and making his world a cage of fear and doubt. He kept a network of informants among his slaves, giving them small rewards for telling him things, an extra ration of salt, or a task that was easier. He set up a system in which the only way to stay alive was to be loyal to him and him alone. He would find out a man's hopes, fears, and child's name, and use that information not to connect with him, but to get what he wanted. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "A man with nothing to lose is a dangerous animal, but a man with something to protect is a useful tool." This trial was to be his masterpiece of control. It was a diabolical calculation. By forcing the slaves to preside over the fate of one of their own, he was shattering any bonds of community, any lingering trust they might have in each other. He was making them part of it. If they condemned Marcus, they would live with the guilt of collaboration. If they acquitted him, they would face the wrath of a master who had been publicly defied. They would be broken no matter what. Elias Vance would win no matter what. He was creating a new sin, an impossible choice, and in doing so, he was remaking God in his own image right there in the suffocating humidity of a Mississippi summer. They say that Elias Vance's father died in strange circumstances years ago. The official reason was a sudden fever. But the old house slaves, the ones who had been there for decades, they remembered something different. They remembered a bad fight between father and son about the plantation's money. It was loud and ended with a door slamming and a long, terrible silence. The old man was dead the next morning. Elias, his only child, got everything. People never talked about it in public, but the story hung around like a bad smell in the corners of Blackwood Manor. It reminded me that Elias Vance was a man who got what he wanted and knew that those who lived to tell the story write history. This trial wasn't the first time he tried to make up his own version of the truth. It was just the most well-known. He was more than just a master. He was also a writer. He was about to write a story in which every character was stuck and only he knew how it would end. He knew how strong a story could be and how a well-told lie could become more real than the truth it was meant to hide. This public event wasn't about punishing a slave. It was about getting rid of a past his own, maybe, and making a new one. A big story of betrayal and justice in which he played the wounded, righteous king. Everyone else was just an actor, with their lines and fates already set. In the sweltering heat of 1842, the curtain was about to go up on his most daring performance yet, with the fate of his entire plantation hanging in the balance. Genevieve Vance was a ghost in her own home long before the trial was announced. She was a woman from Charleston who came to Mississippi with a dowry of fine china and a heart full of coastal light that the humid darkness of Blackwood had slowly put out. She looked beautiful, pale, and fragile, but there was something strong inside her that Elias had not been able to break but had definitely been able to keep separate. She walked through the big, dark rooms of the manor like a sleepwalker. Her voice was almost a whisper, and her eyes were often fixed on something far away beyond the rows of cotton that made her feel trapped. Her marriage to Elias was like a cage, beautiful and comfortable, but still a cage. He was cruel in a more subtle way than hitting her. He chose her friends, controlled her letters, and slowly and methodically cut her off from the world she had known. He wanted her to be a beautiful and quiet decoration that showed off his status. But the silence in Genevieve was not the same as the silence he wanted. It was a quiet time of watching and waiting. She saw it all. She could see the fear in the eyes of the field hands and the quiet desperation of the house servants. She saw Marcus and how Elias made them fight each other. Marcus wasn't a field hand. He was a skilled carpenter and blacksmith. He was a man who stood out because of his intelligence and quiet dignity. He was tall and strong, but what stood out most about him was how still he was. In a world where fear was always grinding, Marcus had a calm center of gravity that seemed unshakable. Elias had given Marcus a job that was a little better than others, letting him keep an eye on the upkeep of the plantation's buildings and tools. It was a bad idea. It brought Marcus closer to the big house and put him in the line of sight of its lonely owner. They didn't talk much to each other, but they did share a look across the well-kept lawn and a polite nod as he fixed a broken shutter on the porch. But in the suffocating stillness of Blackwood, these moments were like flashes of lightning in a dark room. Genevieve would come up with reasons to go to the workshop, like checking on the progress of a new bookshelf or a repaired carriage wheel. She would ask him questions about the iron and the wood, and her voice was warm in a way that it wasn't when she talked to her husband. These short meetings were a dangerous balm for Marcus. He knew he shouldn't take the chance of being seen as a man and having the master's wife talk to him with respect. He kept his answers short and his eyes down, but he couldn't hide the intelligence in them or the spark of humanity that Elias wanted to snuff out in everyone he owned. What kind of relationship did they have? Was it love? A hopeless, desperate dream? Was it something else? Maybe it was a soul conspiracy, with two prisoners in different cells sending signals to each other through the walls. He was the only one who didn't look at her with fear or pity, and she was the only one who didn't think of him as property. Elias, a man who was obsessed with owning things, saw this small exchange of recognition as a betrayal that went deeper than any physical act. It was a threat to the very core of his world. He didn't just own their bodies. He thought he owned their thoughts, their sight, and even their souls. He had seen them look at each other. That was the real crime. It wasn't cheating. It was a rebellion of the spirit, and for that, there had to be a public punishment. The announcement of the trial turned the plantation into a pressure cooker. The air was thick with unasked questions and fear that made people freeze. Work in the field slowed down, and the rhythmic chopping of hoes and the swinging of cotton sacks became hesitant and uneven. Slaves who had known each other their whole lives now avoided looking at each other, scared that a stray word or a sympathetic look could get back to the big house. Elias Vance had broken them up into tiny pieces. He had made it so that every person could be an enemy of every other person. They took Marcus out of his workshop and chained him up in the old smokehouse, which was a dark, windowless brick building at the edge of the property. He was kept alone with only bread and water, with only the sound of silence and the knowledge of what was to come. But what about Genevieve? She was put in a different kind of jail. She was kept in her rooms in the west wing of the manor with a trusted house slave, an older woman named Hattie, who was in charge of watching over her. The doors were locked from the outside, but she wasn't chained. There were silk sheets and mahogany furniture in her prison, but it was still a prison. She was supposed to be the quiet, hidden center of the trial, always reminding everyone of the crime she was accused of. Her shame was to be as well known as Marcus's judgment. Elias was very good at using symbols. He wasn't just putting a man on trial for a crime. He was putting on a passion play in which honor, betrayal, and absolute power would clash in the harsh Mississippi sun. The whole plantation was his stage, and the world was about to get smaller as a makeshift courtroom was built between two old oak trees. The building of the courtroom was almost like a religious ceremony. Elias Vance directly oversaw the slaves who had to build a raised wooden platform under the hanging Spanish moss of the twin oaks. It was a stage that was bare and cruel. There were 3 chairs on it. One in the middle was bigger and more elaborate, a throne-like chair that had been taken from the manor's dining room for Elias himself. To his right was a smaller, simpler chair for the county sheriff, Beaumont. He was there not to enforce the law, but to watch and approve of Elias's own brand of justice. And on the left, a third chair covered in black crepe would stay empty. It was for Genevieve. She wouldn't sit in it. Instead, she'd have to stand next to it, a living statue of a fallen woman. There were rough-hewn benches set up in a semicircle in front of the platform. This was for the jury and the 66 other slaves who lived at Blackwood Manor. They would be forced to sit and watch before making a decision. There was no place for a defense or a witness stand. The building itself told the story. This was a place for accusation and judgment, not for truth. The air around the platform felt colder and the light dimmer, as if the gallows' shadow had already stretched across the packed earth. The slaves who built it worked in a deadening silence, and the sound of their hammers falling was like a funeral march. They were making a cage for one of their own, but they also knew that in a way they were making it for themselves. Every nail that went into the wood was a nail in the coffin of their town. Sheriff Beaumont came to Blackwood 2 days before the trial. He was a big man with a face that was always red from the heat and whiskey. He knew that his power only lasted as long as it helped powerful men like Elias Vance. He wasn't there to get in the way. He was there to give the proceedings a thin, clear layer of the official. As the sun set, he and Elias sat on the porch and drank brandy. They talked about the trial as if it were a necessary but unpleasant part of running a plantation, like putting down a sick animal. "Are you sure about this, Elias?" Beaumont asked, as he swirled the amber drink in his glass. "It's a public matter. It can cause problems. If the abolitionist papers hear about this, they'll have a field day." Elias looked out at the fields with a face that showed no emotion. "Trouble is a sign of disorder, Sheriff. This is about bringing back order, my order. The law of the state is too slow and impersonal for a betrayal like this. This is a family matter, a community matter. They need to see the consequences and take part in the cleansing. It's the only way they'll learn." Beaumont drank for a long time. He knew what this was really about. It wasn't about a slave sleeping with the master's wife. It was about the master showing that he was God and that his will was law. "And the verdict?" the sheriff asked in a low voice. What if they prove him innocent?" Elias slowly turned his head, and his eyes, which were cold and gray like river stones, met the sheriff's. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was just a tightening of the lips. "They won't," he said. The way he said it made it sound like he was sure, which was scary. It wasn't a guess, it was a fact. In his mind, the trial was already over. The public show was just a formality, a way for everyone to be humiliated. Elias Vance did something the night before the trial that sealed the fate of the whole plantation. He called Joseph, the unofficial leader of the field hands, to the big house. Joseph was an old man whose back had been bent from years of hard work. The other slaves respected him because he had a quiet authority and wisdom in his eyes. He was the one they went to when they had problems, the one who settled fights, and the one who kept their weak community together. Elias welcomed him into his study, a room full of leather-bound books he rarely read and maps of land he would never walk. He didn't tell Joseph to sit down. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice calm and almost kind, "your people will be asked to make a decision. They will look to you, Joseph. They will follow your lead." He stopped to let the weight of his words sink in the quiet room. "Marcus has poisoned this place. He slept with my wife. He broke the sacred trust between master and servant and husband and wife. He has brought shame to my house and disorder to this plantation. He is a sickness that must be cut out." Joseph stood still, his face blank and his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He didn't say anything. "I want you to know what's at stake," Elias said in a low voice, as if he were telling a secret. "A verdict of innocence would be a declaration of rebellion. It would be a statement that you and your people have chosen to side with a traitor against me, against the man who provides your food, your shelter. The consequences of such a choice would be biblical." He let the threat hang in the air. He didn't need to say anything more. Joseph knew what it meant. Punishment for everyone, families broken up, and privileges taken away. Elias would use the whip every day as a sermon. He was giving Joseph an impossible choice: kill one man to save the others. He was making him a general in a war he couldn't win, and making him give the order that would doom them all. Joseph left the big house and went back into the dark slave quarters, where he saw a ghost carrying a coffin on his shoulders. His choice would determine whether or not his people would live. He was sure that Marcus was innocent. Not in a legal way. He didn't know what had happened or not happened between Marcus and Genevieve. He knew he was innocent on a deeper level. Marcus was a good man who had never caused trouble. He had used his skills to help others and had a quiet sense of dignity that was a form of defiance in itself. To punish him would mean giving up the best of them to please the worst of their master. It would be a lie that would kill them spiritually and make their physical bondage feel like it was the only thing that mattered. He sat outside his little cabin, looking at the stars and feeling like his neighbors were watching him even though it was dark. They were looking for a sign or a word of advice. What could he say to them? Could he tell them to choose shame and death over life? Could he ask a mother to put her child's health at risk for a principle, no matter how good it is? He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him about revolts on other plantations and the brutal, overwhelming force that was used to put them down. He saw the peaceful faces of the kids sleeping in their cabins, not knowing that their parents were being forced to make an impossible choice. The idea of justice seemed like a cruel joke. There was no fairness here, only power. There was the master's will and the terrible, grinding math of staying alive. His face was a mask of sadness by dawn. He had made up his mind. He would save his people, but in doing so, he would lose his soul. In an 1858 book about how to run a plantation, J.H. Hammond said, "The master is the head of the slave, and he is the head of the wife. His authority is absolute, and her submission is unconditional." This shows that the order on a plantation is the same as the order of God. Elias Vance was not only a follower of this philosophy, he was its high priest. He preached during the trial. He was showing in the most direct way possible that he had the power of life and death over more than just his property. He had the power of family, loyalty, and truth. He was mixing up his own power with God's power. He felt betrayed not only by his wife, but also by a God whose creations had the nerve to have their own will. It wasn't a fit of rage. It was a religious ceremony to remind him that he was the center of his own universe. He was showing his wife, his slaves, and himself that he was the only one who could decide what was real. Genevieve and Marcus had made a small, secret world of their own, one where he wasn't the center. In his eyes, this was a much worse sin than cheating. It was heresy, and as history has shown us over and over, heresy is always punished in the most public and painful way possible. The morning of the trial was heavy and gray, with a lot of moisture in the air that promised a storm that would never break. The plantation bell rang once, a single sad clang that echoed through the fields. It usually signaled the start of the workday. It was a call. The slaves came out of their cabins without saying a word, their faces drawn and sad. They didn't walk like a group. They walked like a line of lonely people toward the Twin Oaks. They sat down on the rough-hewn benches, and there were a lot of scared, sad eyes. The procession from the big house came next. Elias Vance was the first to show up. He was wearing a black suit that made him look like a funeral director. He walked with a stiff, righteous gait, and Sheriff Beaumont followed him, looking uncomfortable and sweating a lot. They sat down on the platform. 2 house slaves then led Genevieve out. She was covered in a white veil that made her look like a ghost, and black lace hid her face. She had to stand next to the empty draped chair like a statue of shame. Finally, they marched Marcus out of the smokehouse with his hands tied behind his back. There were 2 overseers on either side of him, but he didn't fight. He walked with his head held high and a calm, almost peaceful look on his face. He looked at his peers, moving his eyes from face to face, not with anger, but with deep, deep sadness. He knew what they had to do. He knew what they had to choose from. Finally, he looked at Joseph, the old man who couldn't look him in the eye. They understood each other on a whole new level without saying a word. It was letting go. It was a pardon for a betrayal that hadn't happened yet, and that was what finally broke the hearts of the people who had come to judge him. Elias Vance stood there, letting the silence last and the tension build until it was almost too much to handle. He didn't have a Bible or a book of laws. He only had one piece of paper. "We are here to restore the sanctity of this home and this community," he said in a voice that sounded unnaturally clear in the humid air. "We are here to pass judgment on an act of profound betrayal." He didn't look at his wife. He looked at Marcus. This man, Marcus, is accused of forgetting his place, breaking his master's trust, and ruining his mistress's honor. He is a snake we have let into our garden. He then looked at the slaves who were gathered. The law of white men would see this as a simple matter of property and punishment. But I believe in a deeper law, the law of community. You live with this man, you work with him, you know his character. Therefore, you shall be his judges. You will hear the testimony, and you will decide his guilt. The speech was both brilliant and cruel. He was making them feel like it was an honor and a duty to take part. He was making them feel like they had power while pointing a gun at their heads. My wife. Genevieve Vance will give the testimony," he said. He pointed to her, and one of the overseers lifted her veil. Her face was as pale as death, and her eyes were wide open with a fear that seemed to go beyond what was happening right now. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at her husband. For the first time, the crowd saw something other than fear in her eyes. It was hate without any other feelings. This was not Marcus's trial. It was the last act of war between Elias and Genevieve Vance. They took Genevieve to the middle of the platform. They didn't ask her to talk. Instead, they gave her a piece of paper. It was her testimony, and her husband had written it all down. She shook as she held it. Everyone on the plantation, 66 people on the benches, 2 overseers, a sheriff, and her husband was waiting. This one moment, this one forced speech, was all that was left of the world. She started to read, and her voice was a thin, reedy whisper that barely made it through the thick air. The statement was a confession, a graphic, detailed account of an affair. It talked about secret meetings, whispered promises, and a love that burned brightly. The words were flowery, over the top, and completely untrue. They were the words of a man's angry fantasy, not the truth for a woman. A strange change happened as she read. Her voice got stronger the more she told these lies. The shaking in her hands stopped. She raised her head, and her cold, fiery eyes met her husband's. She wasn't just reading the script, she was acting it out with a subtle, defiant tone that only he would get. She was using the words he had forced into her mouth as a weapon against him. She lingered on words of love and devotion, which made the lie seem so real that it turned into an accusation against him. The unspoken message was clear. You are so cold and unloving that this fantasy is the only warmth I can imagine. You are so horrible that this fiction is more believable than my life with you. She was admitting to a crime she didn't commit to show him the crime he committed every day, the murder of her soul. When she was done, the clearing was filled with a deep, unsettling silence. She had done what she was told to do. She had admitted it. She had made Marcus look bad, but no one thought it was true. The acting was too good, and the hate in her eyes was too real. She had used her shame to accuse her husband. Elias's face looked like a storm cloud. He thought he would see a broken, crying woman, but instead he saw a defiant martyr. He had lost control of the story. He took the paper from her and turned to the people. His voice was tight with rage as he said, "You have heard the confession. You admit to the sin. Now you have to choose the punishment." He looked straight at Joseph, the old man in the front row. "Joseph, as the oldest, you will speak for the rest." "Is Marcus guilty?" Joseph stood up slowly, and everyone in the clearing looked at him. He looked at the ground, the sky, and the faces of the people around him. He looked at Marcus, who shook his head slightly as if to say, "Okay, you don't have to keep your promise." But Joseph remembered the threat. He could picture the kids' faces. He took a deep, shuddering breath, which sounded like a soul breaking in half. "He is guilty," Joseph said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. A gasp from the crowd quickly spread. The lie was told. The deal was done. The betrayal was total. Marcus, who was tied up on the platform, closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his cheek and through the dust. He wasn't crying for his own life. He was crying for theirs. Let's go back in time to a month before the trial. Something happened. A secret that had nothing to do with an affair was found out. Genevieve called a traveling doctor to Blackwood to take care of a young slave girl who was dying of lung fever. She trusted the doctor because he was an old friend of her family's from Charleston. He told Genevieve in private that the girl and some other kids in the quarters looked a lot like the Vance family. Their gray eyes were both strange, and their hairlines were both very clear. He meant it as a simple comment, though it was rude, but for Genevieve, it was the last straw in a long line of doubts. She had always wondered why Elias wouldn't sell certain slaves, even when he was offered a lot of money for them. She also wondered why he seemed to care more about a few specific families than others. The doctor said something that made her think of a terrible idea. She started to really look at the kids' faces after he left, and she saw it. Elias Vance, who was obsessed with purity, order, and the sanctity of his bloodline, had a secret family in the slave quarters. He was a very hypocritical person. The man who was now accusing her of ruining his honor had been ruining his own family for years. He was more than just a teacher to these kids, he was their father. This was the information that sealed her fate. This was the real act of betrayal. She stood up to him. It was a huge mistake. She didn't do it out of anger. She did it out of a cold, desperate plea. She thought she could use what she knew to get a little more freedom and humanity in her gilded cage. She said she knew. She told him that the truth was written all over the kids' faces. She thought people would be shocked, deny it, or even try to work out a deal. She didn't expect him to become so calm and still. He didn't say no. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a wife or a woman, but as a threat that needed to be stopped. He said, "You see too much, Genevieve," and his voice was as soft as a snake's. "I'll have to fix that mistake." At that moment, the idea for the trial came to life. It was a work of evil genius. He couldn't just kill her or put her in jail. That would make people wonder. Instead, he would ruin her reputation, her sanity, and even her sense of self. He would make her look like a crazy, lustful cheater. And who would she tell her secret to then? Who would believe the crazy things a disgraced woman says? She needed someone to blame for her crime, and Marcus, the man she showed a little bit of kindness to, was the perfect choice. The trial wasn't just to punish her for what she knew. It was also to get rid of that knowledge from the world. He would turn her and Marcus into such monsters that anything they said would be seen as a lie from a corrupt person. It was the most extreme form of gaslighting, done in front of an audience of hostages on a public stage. He wasn't just burying a secret. He was also salting the ground where it was buried so that nothing could ever grow there again. The word guilty is now in the air, heavy and toxic. Elias Vance gives himself a small, happy smile. The first part of his plan is done. The community is no longer whole. Their own words have made the lie holy. He said in a loud voice, "The punishment for such a crime is death. But again, I won't be the one to give him this justice. His life is in your hands. You have judged him, and you will sentence him." He wasn't going to stop. He was going to push them all the way into the abyss. He was going to make them kill their own. Then he explained how to do it. Not a hanging or a shooting. That was too quick and too kind. It was going to be a stoning, an old punishment from the Bible that everyone in the community had to take part in. Everyone, including men, women, and children, would have to throw a stone. He made everyone a killer and tied them all to him with a sin that could never be forgiven. He wanted to ensure that the memory of this day would haunt them forever, a permanent scar on their collective soul that would prevent any future thought of defiance. He wasn't just killing a man. He was also killing the idea of being together. He was making them all guilty of his evil by baptizing them in the blood of one of their own. The silence that followed his decree was more profound than any scream. It was the sound of 66 souls realizing they had walked into a trap from which there was no escape. They were no longer a jury. They were a lynch mob, and their master was going to watch. Long after Blackwood Manor had crumbled to dust, a story was told by the descendants of its slaves. They said that on the night before the trial, Marcus had managed to get a message out. He had scratched a symbol onto a piece of bark, a Sankofa bird, the African symbol for reaching back to the past to protect the future. He gave it to a little boy who brought him a small meal and told him to show it to Joseph. The symbol said, "Do what you have to do to stay alive, but don't let them kill our memory. Remember the truth." This rumor changes everything, doesn't it? It reframes Marcus not as a passive victim, but as a strategic martyr. He knew he was going to die, but his last act was to try and save the soul of his community, even as they were being forced to take his life. He was giving them permission to betray him physically in order to preserve their spiritual integrity. He was releasing them from their guilt before the crime was even committed. It shows a level of resistance, a deep, hidden flow of communication and strategy that Elias Vance could never have imagined in all his arrogant plans. It meant that even as Elias was staging his play of absolute power, another, quieter drama was unfolding, one of sacrifice, memory, and a desperate attempt to keep the truth alive in the only place it could be safely stored, in the stories that would be whispered in darkness for generations to come. The overseers pulled Marcus off the platform and tied him to one of the old oaks. Genevieve had to watch with a face that looked like it was frozen in horror. Elias Vance then made a motion, and a cart full of stones from the riverbed was pushed into the middle of the clearing. "Start the cleaning," Elias said. He turned to Joseph. "You are older. You will throw the first stone." The old man looked like he had aged 50 years in the last hour. He walked to the cart on legs that were shaking so much that he could barely pick up a small, smooth stone. He turned to look at Marcus, who looked back at him with a blank expression. Joseph closed his eyes, said a broken prayer in his head, and threw the stone. He shot too far. The stone hit the ground several feet from Marcus with a sad thud in the deafening silence. He did it with as much mercy as he could, which was a small act of compliance. "Your aim is bad, old man," Elias said with a sneer. He walked over to the cart, picked up a big, jagged rock, and threw it with all his might without thinking. It hit Marcus in the chest and drew the first blood. Genevieve let out a gasp. The spell was over. Now the other people had to follow. They were forced to come forward one by one, pick up a stone, and throw it at the man who had been their friend and brother. Most of them, like Joseph, threw weakly, and their stones either fell short or missed completely. They were acts of symbolic violence, with their bodies obeying the master's orders while their souls screamed in protest. But some of them, the informants who had already sold parts of their souls for small favors, threw with a terrifying enthusiasm. They may have been trying to prove their loyalty or silence their own shame with violence. The stones hitting flesh, the grunts of effort, and the terrible, deafening silence from the man tied to the tree made it feel like a nightmare that was happening in slow motion. Marcus didn't scream. He took the punishment with a supernatural calmness. His body flinched with each blow, but his spirit seemed to be unaffected. He was looking over their heads, past the trees, as if his mind were already somewhere else, somewhere far away from the pain and betrayal. But the kids were the worst part. They had to take part as well. Mothers held their small children's hands and showed them how to throw small rocks that bounced harmlessly off of Marcus' legs. They were learning the hardest lesson of all, that in this world, love and loyalty could get you killed. They were being taught that in order to live, you have to be ready to hurt innocent people. Elias Vance watched the whole thing with a look of ecstatic, almost religious joy on his face. This was his real victory. He wasn't just killing a man, he was killing the idea of being decent. He was showing that anyone could become a monster if they were pushed hard enough. He was the artist, and the way they all fell apart was his best work. And then something happened that Elias didn't see coming. Genevieve, who had been frozen like a statue, suddenly moved. She ran to the stone cart before anyone could stop her. She didn't choose a small one. She picked up the biggest, sharpest rock she could find. It was so big that she had to use both hands to lift it. For a scary second, the crowd thought she was going to throw it at Marcus as a last, crazy way to get involved. But she didn't look at the tree. She looked at the platform. She looked at her husband. She screamed with rage and sadness, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of her soul, and threw the rock at Elias Vance. It was a completely reckless act of defiance. The overseers stopped her before she could throw another, but the message had already been sent. The sheriff, who was shocked into action, pulled out his gun. Elias was furious that he had ducked just in time because the rock hit the throne-like chair behind him. His face, which had been full of joy just a few moments before, was now a mask of pure rage. His holy ritual of power, his perfect ceremony, had been ruined. His wife, the quiet ornament, had found her voice and used it to ask for his blood. The trial of Marcus was finished. The killing of Genevieve Vance had just begun. The aftermath was quick and violent. The stoning stopped, and the crowd went back to their cabins because the overseer threatened to use his whips. Elias didn't let Marcus die because he had other plans for him now. He cut him down from the tree even though he was bleeding and barely conscious. They dragged Genevieve back to the big house, where she kicked and screamed, and locked her in the cellar. The illusion of a shared justice and the thin layer of order that Elias had tried to make were both broken. What was left was raw, bare power. Elias Vance went down to the cellar that night. No one ever knew for sure what he did to Genevieve down there in the dark and damp. The muffled screams that came through the floorboards, though, would stay with the house slaves for the rest of their lives. He wasn't just punishing her for being disobedient. He was punishing her for telling the crowd that he wasn't a god, but just a man, someone who could be challenged and bleed. He had tried to use her as a symbol of his wife's shame, but instead she had become a symbol of his tyranny. He couldn't let that symbol stay. The house was quiet by morning. They told Hattie, the old house slave, to bring food down to the cellar. Genevieve was huddled in a corner, broken but alive. Her eyes were empty, and her spirit was finally, truly dead. She would spend the rest of her life as a prisoner in her own home, a real ghost, with her mind lost in the darkness of that cellar. Elias had won, but it didn't mean anything. He had made her quiet, but he couldn't take back what she had done. Everyone had seen it. The mask had come off. And what about Marcus? He didn't die. Death would have been a release. Elias had a worse fate in mind. The next day, he was sold not to a plantation nearby, but to a trader going to the deep south, to the brutal sugarcane fields of Louisiana, where people lived for less than 5 years. It was a death sentence, but it was a slower, more painful one. He was given one last chance before they took him away and chained him to a dozen other people. The old man, Joseph, came to him. He knelt down and cried. "Forgive me," he said in a low voice. "I have condemned us all." Marcus looked down at him, and the calm that had been on his face the whole time came back. He said, "There is nothing to forgive. Save the story now. Don't let him be the only one to tell it." This was his last order, a charge to the community he had saved with his life. After that, he was taken away, and the people of Blackwood Manor never saw him again. But his words and the memory of his death would be the start of a secret history that went against the official story of Elias Vance's righteous justice. He would not be remembered as a traitor, but as a martyr who knew that the body could be enslaved, but the story could stay free if it was carefully protected. A young boy, the grandson of one of the kids who had to throw a stone, was playing in the woods near the ruins of Blackwood Manor years later, after the Civil War and after slavery ended. The war had destroyed the big house, and the land was going back to how it used to be. The Twin Oaks were still there, but they were old and broken. The boy found a stone that wasn't stuck in the trunk of one of the trees and pulled it out. There was a small, empty space behind it. There was only one thing inside, a small wooden bird with a lot of detail carved into it. Its head was turned back, as if it were looking at its own tail. It was a Sankofa, which proved the rumor to be true. Marcus had left it there, or maybe someone else had put it there in his memory. It was a real part of the hidden story, a silent reminder of the man who had been killed there. The boy gave it back to his grandfather, who cried when he saw it. For the first time, he told the boy the true story of the trial at Blackwood Manor. He said that some stories are too dangerous to tell out loud, so they are kept hidden in things, songs, and symbols until it is safe for them to be heard again. The bird was more than just a piece of wood. It was a record. It was a vow. It was the spirit of a community hidden in the trunk of a tree. Elias Vance lived a long time. He lived through the Civil War, but he lost his money and land. In 1888, he died in Natchez, a bitter, poor man who had been forgotten by the new world that had risen from the ashes of the old. People said he was crazy in his last years because he talked to himself and raged against the betrayals that had ruined him. He never talked about the trial directly, but sometimes when he was delirious he would talk about a snake in his garden, a wife who had tried to poison him, or a community he had to clean up. He still thought of himself as the good king who had been the victim of a huge plot. He had told his lie so many times and for so long that he started to believe it himself. He died holding on to the false history he had made up, trapped in the same mental cage he had built for others. At least, in the official record, the truth about his hypocrisy and the secret of his other family died with him. He didn't have to face the public or go to trial. His crimes were just added to the long, bloody list of things that have happened in the past, and the rest of the world didn't know or care. But the story lived on in Blackwood, where the families who had lived under his rule had lived. It was kept alive as a warning about the nature of power and the cost of staying alive. What is a ghost? Is it the spirit of the dead? Or is it a memory that is so strong and painful that it stays with you forever? People say that the land where Blackwood Manor used to be is haunted. People who go to the Twin Oaks site say they feel very sad, and that there is a heavy feeling in the air that is hard to explain. Some people say they heard a woman crying softly, or a man's voice saying, "Remember the story." It's easy to write these off as old wives' tales or superstitions. But they might be more than that. Maybe they are the echoes of a wrong that was so bad that the land itself can't forget. It could be that the story of what happened there is so deeply ingrained in the soil, trees, and air that it still sends out its sadness, waiting for someone to hear it. Elias Vance wanted the trial to be a show that would show how powerful he was and then be forgotten, with its true meaning hidden. But he didn't succeed. He made something so horrible that it became immortal in a way. He wanted to write his own history, but in the end, he became a character in a much older and more powerful story. A ghost story that tells us the past is never dead. It's not even past. The public slave trial at Blackwood Manor was an extreme case, but the reasoning behind it was not new. Slavery was like a slow-motion trial in which the verdict was always guilty, and the punishment was a lifetime of being a slave. Elias Vance simply took the most horrible parts of that system and put them all into one day. He turned the ideas behind psychological control, breaking up families and communities, and using fear as the main way to run a government into a public ritual. He wasn't an exception. He was a model. He was the perfect example of the master as an absolute ruler, a man who thought his power gave him the right to define reality itself. That's why his story is so scary and important. It's not just about a mean man on one plantation in 1842. It's about the scary things that can happen when someone has complete control, It's a warning about what happens when one person or group gets to decide not only what is right, but also what is true. Elias Vance's courtroom of fear is a small part of a much bigger horror, and it makes us ask a very uncomfortable question. How many other trials like this happened? Their stories lost to time, and their victims silenced forever. What we know is almost certainly only a small part of what was. Genevieve's story is one of the saddest and most complicated. Was throwing the stone at her husband the last thing she did to get back at him? Or was it an act of justice for Marcus? Can it be both? For months, she had been a silent victim, a ghost in her own life. But in that one moment, she took back control in the most violent and public way possible. She chose to become a monster in their eyes to prove that her husband was the true monster. She knew she would never be able to get out of her cage, so she chose to burn it down with herself inside. She didn't kill him, but she did kill his story. She showed how fake the trial was and how much personal hatred was behind it. In Blackwood's strange world, her violent outburst might have been the most sane and reasonable thing that happened all day. It was a moment of awful clarity. She was speaking the only language her husband really understood: violence. She proved that even the most oppressed, the most controlled person has a breaking point, a line beyond which they will not be pushed. When she threw that stone, she screamed like everyone else who was stuck at Blackwood. It was a single, unified voice of defiance against a power that seemed unbreakable. And Joseph, the old man forced to condemn an innocent to save his community, his story is in many ways the moral center of this entire tragedy. He was faced with a classic trolley problem, a philosophical dilemma made terrifyingly real: sacrifice one to save many. He made the logical choice, the utilitarian choice, but that choice cost him his soul. His story reminds us that in systems of profound evil, there are often no good choices. There is only the choice between the terrible and the catastrophic. From the safety of our time, we can easily say that he should have chosen defiance and stood up for Marcus no matter what. But if we were there, could we look into the eyes of those kids and send them to Elias Vance's wrath to save one man's life, no matter how unfair his death? Joseph didn't choose out of fear. He chose out of a terrible, heartbreaking love for his people. He chose to live with his shame so that they could live. He became the sinner so that they could stay the ones who were wronged. His own damnation was the last thing he did for his community. It's a choice that isn't easy to make, and it makes us face the harsh moral choices that oppressed people have to make every day, in big and small ways. His quiet tragedy may be the most lasting legacy of Elias Vance's cruel theater. Elias Vance's trial at Blackwood Manor did not go well. Yes, he killed Marcus's body and Genevieve's spirit. Yes, he made the community do something horrible that they didn't want to do. But his main goal was to control the story and make an official history of the event that would make him more powerful. And in that, he completely failed. A second story began the moment Marcus said his last words: "Save the story." This was a secret, whispered history that ran parallel to the official one. People passed down this secret transcript from generation to generation. It kept the truth about Marcus's innocence, Genevieve's real discovery, and Elias's deep hypocrisy. It changed a story of shame and betrayal into one of martyrdom and fighting back. This is the most powerful thing that oppressed people can do. If you can't change the present, you can work together to change how people remember it. You can make sure that the truth gets out in the future. Elias Vance owned their bodies, their work, and their kids, but he couldn't own their stories. The story is the only thing that really lasts in the long run of history. The big house is gone, and the cotton fields are paved over, but the truth about what happened under those twin oaks lives on as proof that you can kill a man, but not a memory if there is someone who is willing to tell it. So, what is the truth that comes through? That power, especially absolute power, is a machine for telling stories. It always makes up stories to explain why it exists, like stories about order, justice, honor, and divine right. The trial of Marcus was one of these stories. It was a carefully crafted piece of fiction meant to make Elias Vance stronger. But there is always another story behind every official one. This is the story of the people who were silenced, erased, or forced to be the bad guy in someone else's drama. Not everything that is written in law books or official records is true history. It is the one that is hidden in the gaps, the whispers, the ghost stories, and the carved wooden birds that are hidden in the hearts of trees. You have to be open to what the ghosts say if you want to know the truth. To believe that the official story is almost always a lie meant to protect the powerful, you have to be willing to do so. The story of Blackwood Manor is a harsh reminder that the most powerful acts of resistance are not always loud, violent uprisings, but the quiet, stubborn, and dangerous act of remembering the truth and sharing it. It is a sign of faith in a future that will be ready to hear it. The throne-like chair that Elias Vance had used was the last physical sign of the trial. A local person saved the manor after it burned down and sold it. It was owned by many people over the years, making it a dark, unknown part of history. It is now in an antique store in New Orleans, where people walk by every day and admire its craftsmanship. The wood is scarred where Genevieve's rock hit it, and it is simply labeled Antebellum Mississippi Planter's Chair. People don't know that it was once a throne in a courtroom of hell, where a man played God and a community was torn apart. It is silent, which is a great way to show how the artifacts of our worst histories are often stripped of their meaning and turned into decorations. The proof is all around us, but it's not easy to see. The real story is waiting to be told.